Hello and welcome to Climactic, the podcast for our climactic times. I'm your host for today's episode, Mark Spencer, and today I'm having a chat with a host of one of our new shows. That's right, Climactic is becoming a network, and we're launching a new show about the intersection between arts and the climate crisis. The show's going to be called ArtBreaker, and I'm having a chat today with Beth Spencer, one of the new hosts of this show, and someone with a rather interesting story of how we met and started talking in the first place. Beth, I'd love to hear kind of your perspective on how we got linked up.
Well, you messaged me on Facebook, and I think it was one of those wonderful things that Facebook does, is it connects people that have never met with people who've never met with people who've never met. Mm-hmm. And so it was like through a mutual Facebook friend, and because we had the same surname.
That's right. I'm glad you said it the way that you did, because I tongue-in-cheek, but I did reach out being like, any chance we're related? And no, it turns out that we are potentially very distant members of the same family tree, if the same tree at all. Which
you look uncannily like some of my nephews, but no, I don't think we've got any relationship there. But I really, from this strange beginnings, I feel like there's a real kind of a interesting connection there in the way that the one conversation we've had before this and the different messages we've been sending, that it really feels, I feel really pleased that you did reach out to me and delighted to be invited into this. And the bizarre thing was that I'd actually been thinking I'd really like to do a podcast. I'd like to, interview people, talk about, what's going on and writers with writers and their practice and creativity and why creativity is so important at the moment. But I don't want to have to learn a whole new trick about how to do the podcasting back end and create an audience and all that kind of thing. And then I opened up my messages and there you were.
So if one of these days, folks, you get a random message from me, it might just be something worth pursuing or not. I'm really glad it did work out, Beth, and I think definitely we've got a lot of mutual interests in a lot of places where our interests in the written word and in climate change and where kind of the story of humanity is going, that we've been exploring, we've been talking over, but I'm really excited with this new show to explore the intersection of art and climate and see what comes of it. So speaking about the written word, Beth, I myself am not an author, but I'm fascinated by authors. I'm a huge consumer of books, and growing up as a huge sci-fi fan. I want to learn about your relationship with the written word, Beth, and where your desire to become an author came from.
Well, I actually didn't grow up with many books. I had my mother's sort of Sunday school prizes from the 1930s, which is sort of very old-fashioned stuff. But one of them was Little Women, which you may know from the movie. And that was the first time I came across the idea that there was this thing called a writer that you could be, and that was in the character Jo March, who's a wonderful character. So I had this sort of secret desire to be a writer from like about age 7. My main narrative language, my first narrative language, was actually television. I loved all the sitcoms from the 60s. And
would you mind naming some of the titles that kind of spring to mind?
Bewitched, the Beverly Hillbillies, Max Smart, the Munsters, the Addams Family.
Were you a Bonanza viewer?
The Bonanza? I did watch Bonanza, but I'm really surprised that that's the one you pull out of the hat. I think in terms of the high art of the 1960s sitcoms, I'm not sure if Bonanza fits in there.
Rated.
No. It was.
Well, I watched the Ponderosa, the 90s kind of follow-up 30 years later.
Okay. Or the Jetsons. I think there was a remake of the Jetsons in the 90s, wasn't there?
I don't know. I didn't get that on PBS where I was in the States.
Oh, okay. But a lot of these programs, and I actually think a lot of them were exploring that kind of anxiety. It was like the first space age, and it was a post-war, this idea of post-war prosperity and progress and everything. And so there was this enormous ability to change and create life in the world and everything and reshape it that was going on there. It's, the bombing of Hiroshima was only 20 years earlier. And So I like to look at those sitcoms that a lot of them were, like the Jetsons, which is done in 1962 and was set in 2062, and they're all flying around in their little, eating their pills for lunch and everything. And then you've got Bewitched, which is like a witch who has to suppress her powers in order to have all the mod cons in her house because, her husband's an advertising exec. So there's a lot of, and the Beverly Hillbillies, hillbillies who strike it rich and end up in Beverly Hills. I think it's had a real effect on the way I write because I've never sort of really been, I like reading narrative realism, but when I write, it always seems to be in this kind of fragments and way of piecing fragments together to create a story. That's got a lot of space in it and a lot of juxtapositions and a lot of connections that then fly outside of the actual piece of writing, which when you think about TV, you've got the advertisements interrupting it. You've got
there's a lot of meta text going on.
Yes, it's montage and it's a range of voices. That was my first narrative language. That's what I learnt story from. And so for me to kind of write in a single kind of a voice for a long narrative linear thing that goes for 300-400 pages, it just doesn't kind of work for the way my brain works.
Yeah, which may or may not have been innate, but it was definitely expressed through the media you were exposed to when you were a young woman.
Yes, and then the
TV.
The iPhone age, your brain's wired differently again, and or the smartphone age, I should say. And so I think that sort of those kind of, if that kind of generational thing has any meaning, to me it's around what was your formative way of producing meaning and relating to the world. And so for me, it was television more than books. It was books as well, but it was television.
So TV and the lexicon of TV was kind of the palette you were drawing from when you were starting to think of doing creative work.
Unconsciously, certainly not consciously, but sort of, I think when I started to sort of think, well, why do I write like this? And I think sort of, I also was writing a lot in that time in the 80s when there was a lot of questioning about discursive practices, to use for want of a better word, and why certain forms of language and certain styles of communicating favoured a certain kind of subject or a certain kind of story, or so linear realist language works better for a certain kind of story. Whereas if you're kind of coming from somewhere else, it can be sometimes hard to fit your life into that nice, smooth, linear language. So I guess one of the challenges for me has been how to write in a way that you can tell a story and have that narrative pull that sort of really most people really love, at the same time as leave a lot of space in it and a lot of ability to have different voices. I've returned to poetry in the last few years, and I think the book that I sent you, Back Bondage, it's like a memoir about a year in my life, but told through poetry.
I can see why, through your understanding of the work and how you were relating to not only what you were consuming in your formative years, but how you then approached creating things, wanting to leave space in there for the reader to interpret and to put elements of themselves in there rather than kind of leaving this airless mass of media out there.
And leaving space for me to not be pinned down to one version of myself or one version of that story. You know what I mean? Like you memory, you tell a story and you tell it at one stage in your life and it has certain things about it that make sense. But in a different stage of your life, you might look at it completely different. So I like finding a way to tell a story, to talk about something, but that doesn't lock you into the story, particularly if it's sort of, there might be difficult aspects to it. If you tell, like, people just repeating their story often just locks them into that, I'm victim or whatever it might be. And so to find a way to sort of tell a story that allows you to sort of move around in it yourself and see different things in it when you come back to it, and something is sort of, and I think poetry is a really interesting form for that.
As a form, how has poetry been going, and especially in the Australian context that you've been working in, and What's the landscape been like for poetry?
Oh, it's booming at the moment. I mean, it's not something you kind of have to let go of the idea of making money. But if you can do that, or if you have another way to make money, it's incredibly rich. I mean, there's some just extraordinarily good poets around at the moment, and lots of them, and lots of communities. Like I live in the Central Coast, so I'm in between Sydney and Newcastle, unfortunately a bit too far away from either of them. But both of them have really vibrant communities, and Newcastle's an amazing example of a regional town that has just built this extraordinary supportive poetry culture that then creates very rich poetry out of it. So there's an enormous amount around at the moment, an enormous amount of really good people, and then there's the performance side of it. So yeah, no, it's a very thriving culture at the moment.
And of course, when you talk to a creator about the work they make, they're synthesizing a lot of the environment they're in and what are the overarching themes of the time. So you'd mentioned with the Jetsons and the TV shows you were watching as a young girl that with the Cold War was looming still quite large in sort of collective memory, being only 20 years past at that point. Through the last couple decades of being active in poetry, can you pick out some of the main themes that have affected the community that sort of leading up to today? And of course, we'll kind of talk about how climate change is factoring into people's work and your work and how you're thinking about it. Before we get to the present day, what changes have kind of affected the community over the last couple decades?
That might be something I might have to ask somebody else in
No worries.
another interview. Because there's a whole field of eco-poetics and stuff which I'm not really up with, but I'd be very interested in getting some people who are and talking to them about it. So can we
Well, that's a good teaser for a future question.
Oh, okay.
So, Beth, we're going to start talking about your work and your books of poetry. I'm curious, though, to get into the climate crisis. When did awareness of climate change kind of enter into your perception, and then how did it start to affect your work?
When I was very young, I was quite religious. I was more religious than even the rest of my family for a while. And I think that was because I was terribly troubled by the suffering in the world. And religion seemed to sort of be the only thing at hand that sort of gave me a handle on that. And then as I got older and went to uni and discovered politics, that gave me a much better way of thinking about it. So I think that concern about things has always been there. And I can remember one time when I was about 15 and when I was still going to church, we had this discussion group that I used to go to. And my brother had started going to Swinburne Tech to do engineering, and he started bringing back the student newspaper. And it had this thing in it about that at the time, one of the main brands of tuna, that they were using very young boys to dive to get the tuna or whatever it was anyway. And so they were asking people to stop using that tuna, as boycott it. And I thought, of course we've got to stop using that tuna. I mean, like, who would even think for 2 seconds that you've got to, and so I went, and of course these people at church would be really concerned about that. And so I told them all about it, and they just looked blankly at me. And that was such a sort of a shock to realise that most people aren't prepared to even change the brand of tuna they use to look at these problems that are out of sight, out of mind for them. So I think there was a lot of little points of the sort of quite shocking kind of education there, but I found my people when I went to uni. And I was very fortunate in that. And it was a mix of people who were very into politics, but also some zoologists. So they're very into environmental things and the importance of the smallest little animal, that kind of thing. And back in those days, we didn't call it climate change. It was the greenhouse effect and pollution. More just talked about pollution. And then there's also the campaign to save Lake Pedder, and the wood chipping was a big issue. But it was all sort of tied up with the politics and stuff for me. Is it that long? It's almost 20 years ago. I bought a house in Creswick near Ballarat, my first ever house, a little old house. And I think I started this grand plan of this garden. It was just completely full of weeds at the time. And so I got in the bobcats and the bulldozers and stuff and started trying to create a bit of a permaculture garden. And about 6 months after I got there, stage 4 drought water restrictions came in. And that lasted all the time I was there for 9 years. So we're not allowed to turn a tap on outside. And I'm trying to sort of establish a garden under those circumstances. So I think that might have attuned me more to... There's something about living in the country and gardening that does change the way you think about the world and the environment and so on. And then, of course... we started having those 45-degree days, and it would you'd come outside and the garden would just be blasted. It would, plants would just be white, as if, and then the Black Saturday fires and so on. So, at the same time as getting more and more aware, and then the news this is getting more and more urgent. It's like every month now. They're saying, well, there's less time than we thought to make the changes. At the same time as this incredible shift to the right, I've been thinking for a long time and thinking about the people that were around in the 1930s and aware that the world was heading towards another major war and Nazism and everything. And it's like, if you were in Germany in 1935, at what point would you decide to give up your job, give up everything you were doing and fight it? And so that's sort of been on my mind for quite a few years now, and it's just getting more and more. But I think that sort of sense of that incredible urgency, it's very hard to hold in your head the idea that there's a crisis at the same time as there's just business as usual going on around you.
Yeah, the extreme juxtaposition is really hard.
It's very, very hard to get into that crisis thinking. And so I think that sort of, there just has been that effect of more and more people... And this is why the Extinction Rebellion stuff is just so important. We have to have it in front of our noses every single day in an inconvenient way. And so I think that sort of I'm very grateful to the people that have just been hammering away at bringing it to consciousness because...
you can sustain a crisis mode once you have a critical mass of society mobilizing around it. Yeah, you definitely can't maintain it in isolation.
Yeah, you really need to have people around you to know that you're not crazy to start thinking like that.
Yeah. So we're this ArtBreaker, our new show. We would do some very fancy production work and potentially even have voice actors or friends reading out works along with willing authors when we get them, which is great. Were this a ArtBreaker episode about music, we would have instrument stems and various tracks, and it would all be very ornate and interesting. But this is still climactic, and we're keeping things lo-fi and accessible. So Beth has kindly volunteered to read out one of her poems, and we can have a dramatic reading from the author, and then have a chat about it. I'm really looking forward to it. So, Beth, what's the name of this poem?
So this is called Free Camping, and it's from Vagabondage, which was about, the whole book is about a year I lived in a camper van. So Free Camping, Wild Things. I was thinking about the year we planted the plastic flowers along the fence, so hardy, no watering. Was it the same year I ate the wattle seeds to see if I might die? Or the time I found that rusty knife? I should have known that the seeds were friendly because the wattle sap was our chewing gum. Standing for hours beside the road, picking off the choice bits. Always had a fascination with free food, just for the taking, wild things. The rabbits my brothers would bring back from over the hill, the blackberries in the gully, the mushrooms I loved to collect in my billy, striding through the paddocks, eyes peeled for treasure. Sadly, way too slimy and repulsive to stomach, though I was tempted each year by the aroma, and of course by the free food, collected it myself aspect, pity about the slime. And here, beside a river, I eat kefir for breakfast, nurtured it myself. A culture of bacteria multiplying happily in milk, an ecosystem in a jar. Loves to travel, thinking perhaps of those years it spent riding on horseback over the steppes. Thinking me about the billions of organisms that make up me, whole worlds, and connect me out into other worlds through a skin full of critters, a wilderness of small things, mattering. And I too am a wild thing, growing in my mother's womb unwanted, wrong time, wrong place, twisting and turning, can't get comfortable, entering the world in the witching hour, face up and howling.
So I'm curious in what ways that started to play out in your work, especially at times when you're feeling that crisis mode. Did it feel like an imperative to begin to engage with through writing, which was the medium you were kind of putting your thoughts out into the world with?
Yeah, it's been quite challenging because you sort of think, well, do I just keep writing the books I'm writing because that's who I am? And one thing I have learned over many years of writing is that you kind of have to be the writer you are, not the writer you think you should be. But at the same time, I do see that there's a really strong role for creativity of any kind, and creativity that does explore that kind of personal politics and just the way we think and feel. But at the same time, yeah, it is challenging for me about sort of, am I doing enough? So I have actually started a piece that is more directly confronting it. And I used to always think it was a bit precious when people said you don't talk about a work in progress because you'll jinx it. But I've learned that it's
true. But
now
you're there.
Yeah, now I'm there, and you kind of got to hold the energy of it. And if you start talking about it too much, it does kind of, why write it if you've already talked about it? But so that's the first time it's new for me to do something like that. But I don't think that's the only way artists and writers can respond. I think it's about even just making connections, in the Facebook, is a great connector of artists and writers and people in politics and stuff. And any connection you make with anybody is important for how we're going to get through this. And I think for me, Facebook is kind of like microblogging. And so I share an awful lot of political stuff, and that's one kind of outlet for me. But the way I deal with things is through writing. It's like if you're in it for the long haul, health problems and stuff, that means I can't kind of get out there in the barriers like I would like to. But I think we all have to find our own response to it and our way of connecting in with it. But I think it is about connecting in. And that's why I was very pleased with your, invitation to join your little collective.
Our pirate ship. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on board, Beth. With your decision to get involved in this active way of writing a piece, kind of imagining that future of grappling with it without talking about details or anything. But the decision to get to that point, was that because you were exposed to other like-minded people, you were seeing other works? This was kind of a thing that you could see was a way in which you could begin to grapple with climate change?
It's actually been quite an interesting experience so far, because by imagining the worst and then trying to sort of, how would you choose? How would you cope with that ethical dilemma and this thing and so on? Because to me, it's not just about what's happening to what we think of as nature, but it's also the kinds of choices and decisions we're going to be confronted with. It was almost calming in a way to actually confront it. And I guess it's like, I don't know, not having had a terminal illness, but maybe there's a point when you have a terminal illness when you recognise that you have, possibly limited time, and you have to just choose to be the best you can be.
Yeah. As
well as still try and do things to try and stave it off or make it last as long as, or be as less painful or whatever. But it's if we're on the way out as a species, how do we die? Do we die with integrity, or do we die just, eating each other kind of thing? Yeah. I think those things matters. Every choice you make still matters. In the same way as that sort of when I was 15, recognising that the choice you make, even a choice you make in what tuna you buy, has an effect all through the world. Has effect on the other side of the world and so on. That every choice we make in how we relate to each other and consume is part of this whole thing and is going to make a difference in some way, for good or ill, in the whole thing. So we still got to just keep living. I mean, I guess it's like that Buddha saying that after enlightenment, chop wood. Sort of even when you've got to go, okay, this is probably happening, you've still got to work out how to live in the best way you can. Yeah. As well as trying to contribute something to try and lessen the impact of it or to change it or whatever. But for me, it's also very much about politics. I mean, I've... a family member was sort of sent me a message saying, oh, I agree with you about the climate change and all this kind of stuff. But I know he voted Liberal. And I just think, he's saying, I try and do the best. I have solar and try and recycle a bit and stuff. And those little tiny decisions are important. But then if you go and vote in a government like this, they're making massive decisions and choices and changes that are going to have huge effects. And so, in a way, I still see sort of who you vote for is probably one of the most important things you're going to do.
So here's the question then, Beth. As a writer, could you write a character? Could you really inhabit someone who holds that contradictory nature of believing in, like, acknowledging the truth and yet voting against it for surface anodyne reasons?
It's not, it doesn't sort of, it's a thought. That's an interesting thought. You might want to write that one. But yeah, no, that would be an interesting story. It's again, it comes back to people not wanting to change their tuner. It's sort of, they'll change things that they find comfortable to change, but the idea of voting Liberal all your life.
You just don't want to be the first. I guarantee the people at that church, it's not that they were opposed to changing the type of tuna, it's just they didn't want to be the first one to do it.
Well, they thought it was silly. They thought I looked crazy. Yeah, maybe. Maybe some of them did change the tuna. Maybe the ones that didn't speak up and didn't say, well, who cares? Maybe there was someone sitting there who went out and changed their tuna. I mean, you just don't know who you're going to affect, do you? Or what something you say is going to have an impact. And I really like that idea that, people need to be exposed to an idea many, many times. And so you never give up on anybody.
No, they could be one why question away from realizing, I don't actually have a good answer to this.
Yeah, but at the same time, I don't bother with people who are rusted on, right-wing denialists, whatever.
So much attrition
I don't I'm not interested in arguing with them, because if there's been a history of there's nothing we say that's ever going to change their mind, and but that doesn't mean that you don't talk to people, because a lot of people say, there's no point in talking to people who don't, who vote the other way, because you can't change people. But you only have to change a tiny, tiny percentage of people in the middle. People who don't vote at all, or the people who donkey vote, or informally vote, or who don't think it matters, who've been convinced that is not important. If everybody who whinged about those people on Facebook actually had conversations with them over the next couple of years, it would change everything, because those people can be changed with information. So, yes, I think we've got to learn to have those uncomfortable conversations too. I don't know about you, but I was brought up, you don't talk about those things. But and it's hard to talk about politics with people that you see either at work or wherever you are, family members or something. But I think we have to be prepared to have those conversations and learn how to have those conversations in a skilled and kind way, and to learn to save your breath from the ones that really are never going to change. Fine.
Or that are probably going to
require you to change.
You're able to put in. That's true. We don't have to get everyone.
You don't have to get everyone. You only need to have a small percentage to change. And even though there's so much wrong with the Labor Party, there would have been a vast difference if they were in.
Yeah, that's
Vast difference.
That's right. So, to sort of steer it back to our new project and what we're really excited to have you on for, Beth, is one of the inaugural hosts of ArtBreaker. I'm curious, what's a time, if you can remember, that your mind was changed or your perspective was shifted or widened because of art?
See, the strange thing is that what's coming to mind is not something that's shifted me, informationally. But it's the first time I read Prufrock, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot.
I don't know it. I'm an uncultured.
Oh, okay. It's Let Us Go Then, You and I. And it's a very famous poem that I did in HSC, and I'd never been exposed to poetry. I can remember exactly where I was when I read it, and it just blew my brain. I mean, he was actually quite right-wing, I think. But it was just that use of language that was just so... I kind of feel it did something to me. And I'd like to think that it's not necessarily the informational content that gets put in by art and creativity and beauty and that magic of something that's just put together in a different way. It's also that it shifts something in your brain, and that then can allow in other ideas, maybe with a bit more ease. So this is called Wild Things 2, a serenade. I would like to sing a song to the loose, the wandering and the unattached, to those who cannot grow themselves in rows for the benefit of others. I sing to the ones whose invisible roots disappear down deep into the earth to bring up treasure, to those whose mutations may one day prove beneficial when all hope has failed. To all those still unmet, I salute the wild things, the untamed, the disarrayed, the ones impelled by their own sweet, strange DNA to take hold even when life is harsh and keeps slipping out of reach, extending under fences to the despair of gardeners, offering themselves as refuge and shade, striding forth in the wake of the bulldozer, first after the fire, bedding themselves into clay and shaking it. Opportunists, diagnosticians, red flag wavers, signallers of deficiencies and imbalance, resistors to the end. I salute even those that in the presence of crimes, ignorance, neglect, greed, become thugs, a mirror, the ones saying, too much here in too few hands, too much and too long, a disrespect of the sensitive and their protectors, the rare and the different, too indiscriminate, poisonous, and I will take it back and take it over and create a tide of seed that covers everything and entangles generations. I salute you, O wise and terrible weeds, the tasty and the bitter, the nourishing and the deadly. I honour that small wisp that separates you from fruit and flowers, and the crack in me that holds you dormant until ready or not.
So beautiful.
It's even better when they've got the music and everything around it. Some students at University of Western Australia made the most beautiful video out of this poem, and I had nothing to do with it, and my publisher just sent me the link to it one day, and it's on YouTube, and I'm up to it in the notes, and they did such a beautiful job, which is often not the case with people reading other people's work, and with the visuals and music by Chris Zabriskie, and it was done by a woman called Oakley Fletcher. I really like this poem, and I think it might fit some of what we've been talking about, hopefully.
So, Beth, to wrap it up, maybe a final question, leave us pondering something on the way out here. I was wondering if you could tell us about a particular piece of art that has or does still deeply move you.
That's such a great question, and I found that very difficult to sort of think of any one thing like that. And all that popped up for me was one of the epigraphs I used in Vagabondage was from Michel Foucault, and he said, "But couldn't everyone's life become a work of art? Why should the lamp or the house be an art object, but not your life?"
Welcome to ArtBreaker.